In the winter of 1944, a 19-year-old American soldier named John Hawk crouched in a frozen ditch somewhere in Belgium with no food, no winter coat, and temperatures dropping to minus 20 degrees. His feet were so frostbitten he could no longer feel them. Around him, the last surviving members of his squad were barely breathing. The Germans had surrounded them on 3 sides. There was no air support. There was no rescue coming. And the man in charge of their entire division had just sent back a one-word reply to a German demand for surrender. That word was nuts. This is not just a story about World War II. This is a story about what happens when ordinary people are pushed far beyond the edge of what any human being should be able to survive, and somehow survive anyway. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944. Adolf Hitler had a plan that almost everyone around him told him was insane. The war was clearly turning against Germany. The Allies had landed at Normandy 6 months earlier. Paris had been liberated. Soviet forces were closing in from the east. By every rational measure, Germany had already lost. But Hitler did not operate by rational measures. He believed that if he could smash through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, split the Allied lines in 2, and capture the port of Antwerp, he could force Britain and America to negotiate a separate peace. He would then be free to throw everything he had against the Soviets. It was a gamble so desperate, so enormous, that even his own generals thought he had lost his mind. He launched it anyway. On that December morning, over 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks broke through the Ardennes in a massive surprise assault. The attack hit American lines that were thinly held by exhausted men who had been sent there specifically because it was supposed to be a quiet sector. A place to rest. A place where nothing happened. Something very much happened. Within hours, entire American units were overrun. Thousands of soldiers were captured. Communication lines were cut. The weather was so bad that Allied aircraft could not fly. The Germans moved fast, punching a hole 80 miles wide and 60 miles deep into Allied territory. It was the largest and bloodiest battle the United States fought in the entire war, and in the opening days, it looked very much like Germany might actually pull it off. At the center of this chaos was a town called Bastogne. It sat at the intersection of 7 major roads. Whoever held Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. The Germans needed it. The Americans could not afford to lose it. The 101st Airborne Division was ordered to hold the town. They had been rushed in so quickly that many of them had no winter clothing, no artillery shells, almost no medical supplies, and not nearly enough men. The Germans surrounded the town completely. No supplies could get in. No wounded could get out. American soldiers were sleeping in foxholes in the snow, cutting their bandages in half to make them last longer, eating frozen mud off their boots because they had not eaten in days. The German commander sent a formal written demand to the American general inside Bastogne. The message was polite and precise. It said that the American position was hopeless and that surrender was the only humane option. It gave General Anthony McAuliffe a 2-hour window to respond or face complete destruction. McAuliffe read the letter, laughed, and wrote back one word: nuts. When the German messengers received the reply and asked for clarification, an American officer named Joseph Harper told them it meant the same thing in the language of both armies. It was not a surrender. It was not a negotiation. It was a single word that said everything. The Americans would hold. Back in that frozen ditch outside the perimeter, young soldiers like John Hawk were fighting battles that history books rarely mention. The famous story focuses on generals and strategies and turning points. But the real war happened in the mud and ice, one freezing hour at a time, fought by 19-year-olds who had never expected to be soldiers at all. John Hawk was from Bremerton, Washington. He had been a quiet kid. He liked baseball. He had never been in a real fight before the Army sent him to Europe. By December 1944, he had already seen more death than most people encounter in an entire lifetime, and now he was lying in a ditch waiting for a German advance that everyone around him believed would kill them all before morning. What happened next is the kind of thing that sounds like fiction. When the German infantry pushed forward, Hawk did not wait. He grabbed a machine gun that had belonged to a fallen soldier, stood up in the open, completely exposed, and laid down covering fire long enough for the survivors of his squad to fall back to a better position. Then he did it again, and again, moving from position to position, drawing fire toward himself, buying time for other men to live. He was wounded. He kept going. He was wounded again. He kept going. General Patton's Third Army was racing north to relieve Bastogne. Patton had done something that military historians still talk about today. He pivoted an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter, in the middle of a battle, and drove it toward Bastogne through some of the worst weather in European history. The logistics alone were almost impossible. The roads were ice. The vehicles kept breaking down. The men were exhausted. Patton demanded they move anyway. He made a phone call to his chaplain and asked him to write a prayer for good weather. The chaplain was confused. Patton explained that he needed the clouds to clear so Allied aircraft could fly and end this thing. The chaplain wrote the prayer. Patton had it printed on small cards and distributed to every soldier under his command. He then sent the chaplain a commendation for outstanding service. Whether it was divine intervention or coincidence, the weather broke on December 23rd. The skies over Belgium cleared for the first time in weeks. Within hours, Allied aircraft were in the air. Supply planes dropped food, ammunition, and medical equipment to the besieged men in Bastogne. Fighter bombers hammered the German columns that had been advancing with complete air cover and no opposition from the sky. The momentum of the battle shifted in a single afternoon. On December 26th, the lead tanks of Patton's Third Army crashed through the German encirclement and reached Bastogne. When the first American tank rolled into the town square, the soldiers who had been trapped there for 9 days did not cheer. Many of them were too exhausted to stand. Some of them wept. Some of them just sat down in the snow and stared at the sky that had finally cleared above them. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month. The fighting in the forests and villages of Belgium and Luxembourg was brutal and grinding. It was not a clean Hollywood victory. American casualties by the end numbered over 70,000 dead, wounded, and captured. It was a price so enormous that it is difficult even now to comprehend. But Germany had spent everything it had on that gamble. The tanks that punched through the Ardennes were tanks that could never be replaced. The fuel those tanks burned was fuel Germany could never manufacture again. The soldiers who died in those frozen forests were soldiers Hitler had no way to replace. After the Bulge, the war in the West was a matter of time. John Hawk survived. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for what he did in that frozen ditch. The citation described him as having displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty, which is military language for a 19-year-old kid standing up in the open and refusing to let his friends die. He went home to Bremerton, Washington. He went back to being quiet. He never talked much about what he had done. Most of the men who fought in those freezing Belgian fields never did. They came home, got jobs, started families, went to church on Sundays, and carried something enormous and invisible inside them for the rest of their lives. When people talk about World War II, they usually talk about dates and operations and commanders. June 6th, Normandy, Eisenhower. They talk about the sweep of history. And the sweep of history is real and it matters. But the sweep of history is made of individual men lying in individual ditches in weather that would have killed most people before noon, deciding in that single frozen moment to stand up anyway. The Battle of the Bulge was the last major German offensive of the war. After it failed, Allied forces crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces closed in from the east. Within 5 months, Adolf Hitler was dead, Berlin was rubble, and the war in Europe was over. It ended because a general said nuts to a surrender demand. Because a young man from Washington State stood up in the snow when every instinct in his body was screaming at him to lie still. Because a chaplain wrote a prayer for good weather and Patton actually believed it would work. Because thousands of ordinary people chose, in the worst conditions imaginable, to hold on for 1 more hour. History is almost never made by extraordinary people. It is almost always made by ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary moments and decide, for reasons they themselves could probably not fully explain, that this is the moment they are not going to quit. The Battle of the Bulge lasted 41 days. It killed and wounded more American soldiers than any other battle in the entire war. It was the moment Germany threw its last real punch. And it was stopped by freezing, hungry, exhausted teenagers in foxholes who had no idea they were changing the course of human history. They thought they were just trying to make it to morning.